When we say we want to think beyond growth, I think we need to define what we're talking about when we're talking about growth. We're talking about kind of two things. One is this kind of obsession we have with the GDP and the fact that that always needs to keep growing, and then the material growth that we have in our economies. We absolutely need to stop using as many materials. We absolutely need to stop using as much fossil fuel energy, because we are going over planetary boundaries. Already 6 planetary boundaries in emissions, in biodiversity have already been surpassed. So we are basically taking away from the future, essentially, in the name of trying to keep our economies growing. So we absolutely need to move beyond this physical growth, but we also need to stop kind of the obsession with the GDP, because that essentially only really records everything that we're producing and everything that we're consuming, but it is not recording things like growing inequality or the basic needs that we need.
But we're so used to it. When we come to an election, we think, oh, well, hang on, the government, it's had weak growth. So we're worried about any sort of policy that's not leading to growth. How would you reassure us that basically growth isn't linked to how prosperous or how happy we'll be?
Well, I mean, I think already it's there in the data. I mean, we don't see, as I mentioned, growing GDP doesn't show us like the rise in inequality, for example, or the rise in stress, or the rise in depression and anxiety related to the many crises that we're in.
It makes inherent sense that we can't keep growing in a finite planet. When we run out of resources, then we're in trouble. So it makes sense. But we need, I guess, that it becomes national policy, so governments can not only understand what you're trying to say, but also then sell it to sceptical voters. How's that going to happen?
Well, I think we actually showed with this conference that we are kind of on the way to making that happen. I mean, we had all the kind of major political parties present. There was a consensus, and I think really importantly, a consensus around this idea of there being planetary boundaries and that we need to get back within them. So that is already happening. There was also a consensus that we need to move towards different indicators of well-being. And we're seeing that in other countries. We're seeing that in places like Scotland and Wales and Ireland, that they're moving towards indicators of economic well-being, away from just using GDP as a measure. So it's kind of already happening.
We've been through this major thought experiment, the corona crisis,
yes,
when we weren't working all the time non-stop and flying around the world and getting as fast as we could in cars to work and back. Do you think that rather painful thought experiment actually helped us rethink growth?
Yeah, absolutely, and there were obviously surveys around the time that showed that. There was one in the UK that we were talking about where I think the vast majority of people said they didn't want life to go back to normal. Of course, it was awful for many people, and we shouldn't forget that. And there was many countries that couldn't afford to do the things that we did, which was also another point, and we addressed this with conference as well. We were able to afford to allow people to stay at home in safety, putting health and well-being. So that was another of the narratives that we challenged as well at the conference, is the idea of what we can actually afford and how we can actually satisfy our human needs without growth.